Good afternoon. I'm Heather with OneSource, and we're thrilled to have you join us today at our webinar on self-funding cybersecurity for the mid-market enterprises, presented by Hyun Park with Amalgam Insights. We will have a brief Q&A session near the end of the presentation. To submit your questions, please click the Q&A button near the bottom of the screen. Thanks so much, and I would now like to introduce Hyun Park, who is the founder and CEO of Amalgam Insights. Park is an analyst focusing on technology expense management, data management, and model management challenges based on 20+ years of vendor, enterprise IT, and industry and analyst experience. Welcome, Hyun.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everybody showing up. This topic around self-funding cybersecurity is interesting, especially given the situation we're in. Just a quick note on what I do. So I'm an industry analyst. You guys may have an idea of what that means if you've seen reports by the likes of, say, Gartner or Forrester. I would say that we're in the same boat at Amalgam Insights. We write reports across expense management, IT management, DevOps, and data management. My experience has mostly been on a combination of IT and telco. So I've either been working for the phone companies where I provided these extremely long and tedious bills that were impossible to read, or then I came over to the IT side to try to fix the problem for enterprises and managing the data associated with that. So all that aside, what we're really here to talk about is security, and it's hard to avoid the 800-pound gorilla in the room talking about coronavirus and how this is affecting security. So before I go on to the self-funding security piece, first let's talk about what cybersecurity kind of means in our current age. When we were looking at this problem a couple weeks ago, first place we started was by trying to figure out how much this would really affect, in this case, the American workplace. And what we saw is that we estimate that the percentage of employees working from home full-time in the time of Corona will increase from 5% to 32%. And the way we got to that number is pretty straightforward. The 5% number is basically, last year, 5% of people said overall that they worked primarily from home. 95% didn't. Obviously, that's not going to hold true with today's policies. A lot of us are in some form of either voluntary or forced lockdown. And when you look at the numbers, about 40% of Americans have some sort of professional job that can be done remotely. Frankly, the other 60% don't. And of that, we are estimating, obviously, that the majority of those professional workers will be choosing to or be forced to work from home. So what's this mean? When you go from 5% to 32%, it means massive changes in the use of remote technologies, everything from the endpoints being used, to the networks being used, to the applications put into place, the remote access capabilities that exist. So obviously, huge changes that exist. If you've been on either a Zoom call like this or a WebEx or any other type of conferencing call, chances are this week you had some problems with at least one or more of those calls. And that's because it's just overwhelming the systems. Basically, conferencing has doubled over the past 2 weeks and will probably double again before we're done in the next month and a half. So it's no surprise that both Zoom and WebEx are having challenges for certain types of calls, as well as that they will be extremely popular in the months to come. So a few key areas to think about when you're looking at cybersecurity and some immediate issues that need to be fixed this month. First of all, contacting employees at home. The classic phishing issue of talking to employees doesn't get any easier when they're working from home and lack the corporate structure that they're used to having when you call a corporate phone line. So make sure that remote employees are aware that just because Bob from IT happens to be calling, not to immediately give away your first name, last name, employee ID, social security number, email address, and password to for any usernames and for any systems that exist. That still comes into play, but it's easy to forget about things like that at a time when we are more worried about more fundamental things like staying safe and not getting sick. Second of all, thinking about personal computers and devices. Have we put the same level of antivirus, anti-malware, and device management capabilities on these computers and devices that exist in the workplace or with work-based devices? Realistically, this week and in the next couple weeks to come, employees are just trying to get their job done. Understandably, security standards will be a little lax as people try to figure out what their new normal is. But once that new normal is established, we've got to start getting these computers and devices back into control and make sure that we understand what's actually being used to make sure that corporate standards are being held. Third of all, around consumer networking, of course, we're going to be increasingly dependent on home networking standards. The good news is that these are oftentimes better than what we're able to access in the workplace on a per person basis. Of course, the challenge here being simply that you also want to make sure that work environments aren't being hampered by the use of Netflix or other streaming technologies. You got to keep the kids happy and you got to keep them engaged throughout the day, but make sure that doesn't get in the way of work to the extent that is possible, and make sure that there are security aspects in place from a remote access and networking perspective. Fourth of all, remote access to apps. Depending on whether you're more SaaS-based or on-premises based for your apps, this is going to determine your strategy here. This could include things such as VPN, direct access to apps, getting additional licenses for apps for those who may not have had direct access previously, because you could get away with simply using somebody else's account at work or being able to access information through a colleague at work. Obviously, that's not quite as easy now that we're all working from home. And then finally, delayed IT contact and response. This is realistically going to be an issue as we're all shifting over to a remote work environment. How do I even get in touch with corporate IT? What's the response time going to be like now that there's probably 5, 10, 15 times as many questions about what the heck do I do? There needs to be some realistic expectations both about contact and response, as well as what that means from a security management perspective. So here's some immediate keys to put into place as you start thinking about remote security and things to fix in the short term. Moving from there, obviously there are some key standard cybersecurity business threats that we face, such as phishing, simply emails or calls set to imitate people and used to try to socially penetrate your corporate environment. Adware, software that forces users to watch ads in online windows. This is one that I'm especially worried about as employees work from home, often on their own home computers, and are mixing personal usage with business usage to an even greater extent. Employees need to be careful, especially during work hours, that they're not accidentally clicking on something that will mess up their computers. Spyware, obviously something that we still care about. Insider data breaches and theft, thinking about how users are going to accidentally provide access to your corporate data. This could be by actively providing either access to third parties or actually accidentally giving access to third parties, but through the use of mobile apps or websites that end up being able to access what you do. So this is a real concern as well as at home when your defenses are kind of lowered to thinking about what is appropriate and what is not from a corporate perspective, as well as the need to get work done and perhaps not doing any due diligence on the apps being used. So just a warning to share with your employees as they are starting this remote work process. And then finally at the bottom here, ransomware, software designed to block user access to critical data. As horrible as this sounds, we're going to talk more about this throughout the rest of the presentation, as frankly, people who provide ransomware in the first place are bad people and willing to take advantage of bad situations, which totally matches where we are today. So kind of combining these, looking at the top around key issues that you're thinking about, and then key security topics. We have a lot that we're trying to do here from a cybersecurity perspective. And frankly, for those of you who are, call it mid-market companies, especially those under $1 billion, call it 1,000 employees or less, maybe a little bigger than that, 2,000 employees. But, we're not talking about, the companies I'm talking to right now. You're not huge enterprises with armies of IT people to be able to pour at any specific problem. Let's talk about what the situation you're probably in. We at Amalgam Insights estimate that between 55 and 65% of small and medium businesses, again, between that 50 and 1,000 employee range, have no plans or policies to deal with a security breach. Meaning something happens, you're making up your response on the fly. And yes, you may be expert in understanding what to do next, but there may not necessarily be a corporate formal policy to figure out how to deal with a breach that comes in place. Given the risk profile that we're in right now, that becomes a bigger problem for companies trying to figure out what are we going to do if George or Sally ends up clicking on some XYZ that ends up creating a malware issue or a ransomware issue and locks us out of some specific area. How do we even respond to that? This is obviously something that you need to think a little bit more about in this day and age. So, there's several metrics that we look at here at Amalgam Insights. First, this idea of internally managed security. What's the cost of that? And we've, in speaking with our community over the past year, we found that the cost of internally managed cybersecurity, so fully in-house cybersecurity, grows from about $250,000, including the talent, tools, and time and training for a $50 million revenue company, to almost $2 million as firms to grow over to over 500 million in revenue. So thinking about that from a percentage of revenue perspective, companies end up spending about 0.4 to 0.5% of their revenue solely on cybersecurity. And the reason for that is obviously because the risks are there, right? So moving down to the bottom here, bottom right, the cost of a single data breach can range from about 400K to 2.2 million. And this is a range of kind of the middle range of a data breach. Obviously it can be higher. If you're fortunate, it can be lower, but we're talking about significant issues that come into place when your sales data or your corporate data or your patient data or your client data gets exposed to the world or locked up or locked up by a specific bad actor. So as we look at these numbers, we have an idea of kind of what is expected to be spent at certain tiers of revenue. And obviously, as companies are just getting started, this may mean a basic managed service. As you get up to a certain size of revenue, this may mean bringing in an in-house expert. And as companies get larger, they tend to spend more because once you start building security in-house and have to bring in additional resources, obviously that can get additionally costly. And these are the costs that are expected in, I would say, normal times from a business perspective. And because we did a lot of this surveying over the past 6 months, but I would say before we all went remote. Obviously, these are not normal times. We are in, because of COVID-19, and this remote environment, we have increased stress. So an example of this, back in January 29th, the IBM X-Force, the security aspect of IBM, was warning us that Japan was reporting corona-based spam. Basically, employees were getting corona-based emails just saying, here are best practices for dealing with the coronavirus. Obviously, this is something that we are dealing with right now. Everybody wants to know, what are we supposed to do? What's our corporate policy? What are best practices? What do we need to do to stay safe? And often we are being sent relatively innocuous looking emails with attachments that are supposed to tell us what to do. So obviously, when this was happening starting in Japan a couple months ago, the malware and black hat guys all came in and took advantage of it to start trying to spread some sort of a computer virus or some sort of malware. This is going to be an issue that we face as well, because this is a time to be able to get through firewalls, get through security, get through traditional corporate security policies and tools that have protected us. So we're going to need to improve our security profile and provide security tools to our colleagues. So how do we start doing that? Obviously, we also have the same issue that, a related issue that with Corona, many of you may have noticed this little stock market hiccup that we've had, quite more than a hiccup really. A real financial bear market that we're dealing with, where stocks have gone down 30%. And what happens now? Because of that, from a practical perspective, that takes away from our ability to spend cash immediately. So we need to start finding cash in non-traditional areas or cost centers that have not been fully analyzed in the past. So where do we start finding IT budget in a cash-tight environment like this? When I look at this, I think about back to 2008 when we had the Great Recession. And we had very similar issues. We had to prioritize IT budget on the right things, and we had to find specific areas where we could cut costs to a significant extent. And one of the areas where there's a real opportunity is technology expense management, specifically looking at telecom, network, mobility, and to some extent SaaS and cloud expenses. And there's this kind of cycle of inventory service and invoice management that allows you to optimize these costs and often get 20% or more savings through the management of these bills. So just think about all of the phones in your organization that were never turned off, or that have a rate plan that is too high, or the phone lines that were never cut off from an office that was closed or an office that was moved. All of these usage issues and opportunities that exist around cutting costs around telecom network mobility and kind of technology assets and services. Good news is that this is a mature practice. This is a capability that is out there. And I think your opportunity is to really be able to cut costs here in an area that has already been defined as an IT cost, and potentially to be able to use this from a security perspective. So kind of giving an example of what this might look like. Think about a company called 1,500 employees, 350 million in revenue, kind of a larger SMB type. When we look at this, when IT costs from looking kind of at that, especially this telecom and network area, we're talking about a company that likely has well over $1 million in kind of these subscription costs that can, these monthly costs that can be optimized, including kind of 500K in network, 250K in telecom, 250 in mobility, probably some late fees because these bills are coming in so fast and are so big that they're not getting processed very quickly. As well as you probably have some level of cloud and software or SaaS costs as well. This is kind of, I would say, lower than average price costs that you can expect, and because I wanted to be conservative here. So when you look at the potential savings opportunities, what we find is that typically in spend that looks somewhat like that, there's about a 20 to 25% opportunity for network and mobility reduction, as well as possibly another 5% or more looking at hardware and asset optimization, leading to a potential savings that's well over $200,000. So this is a real opportunity to try to start digging into costs, especially when you have IT spend that is over $1 million per year. This is an immediate opportunity to be able to cut these costs because fortunately this technology expense practice starts bringing in cost savings roughly in this 60 to 90 days after you start. So this is not like something that takes a year or two, despite having this whole cycle of capabilities here. Fortunately, because these processes are fairly well defined, we're not talking about a process that takes an incredible amount of time to put into place. Given all this, some recommendations to be able to take full advantage of telecom expense, technology expense, as well as remote work security issues in today's environment. So first of all, key issue, identify security gaps between at-work IT and at-home devices and networks currently used to conduct work. This is going to take, obviously, some detective work at this point, as all your employees who are starting to work from home are really in earnest doing this probably this week to start with. But make sure that this doesn't disappear, or else your organization will be significantly at risk going forward. Second of all, social isolation and social vigilance are important security measures for remote work employees. So that what I mean by social vigilance, going back to keeping track of the emails and the calls that employees get, and giving employees some way of being able to understand and verify whether these contacts are legitimate or not. Make sure that your remote employees are prepared. Next of all, remember, remote ransomware opportunists are awful and desperate people. This means that this is going to become more of an issue over the next couple of months, definitely. Your organization already at risk because of remote work issues, perhaps cash flow issues, now also has to deal with increased attacks and attempts to grab your money, as everybody out there is desperate, including the bad guys. So be aware of that. Next up, cutting unnecessary costs and focusing on the health of the company. Of course, on the security side, we care about the health of the company and maintaining and managing risk. But this also means being able to cut unnecessary costs from an IT perspective. And often these go hand in hand, because it's good governance to be able to reduce the usage of reduce assets that are not being used. Those are potential threats anyways, because somebody can access your corporate assets that are you're currently paying for and are active, but that you're not using. So you might as well be getting rid of those anyways, or being able to reduce usage or reduce overhead capacity that's not being used. The goal here is to keep people working, keep the business running, meaning IT needs to be governed and cleansed better than ever before. This doesn't mean cutting people off from the tools that they need, but it does mean making sure that you run a clean and tight ship at a time when the company needs it most. So with that, thank you so much for coming in. And with that, I'd love to take questions. Okay, so let's see. Just checking the Q&A here, just giving a couple more seconds. Okay. One question I've got. We're going fully remote, like everyone else is right now. How do we protect our devices? So how do we protect our devices? So if you haven't done so already, you definitely want to start by having some sort of enterprise mobility management capability and make sure that your employees are signed up for that. If they are using devices that are not corporate owned, put a policy in place to be able to manage those devices or to describe which devices are okay for business use. This may include getting companies with using devices with some sort of dual profile, where there may be a work profile that is managed by you, as well as a personal profile, which they're free to use however they want. But you do need to have some sort of device strategy that includes being that puts personal devices into place. It's no longer okay to simply have a corporate device policy and hope that that's enough to manage devices. Let's see. Should we, second question, should we expect our bills to go up as we go remote? How will that affect this strategy to reallocate costs? So interesting question, because obviously as we're remote users, we will obviously be using these devices and usage to a greater extent. One thing that we are seeing is that carriers are providing some leeway for unlimited usage or for data that allows companies to pay for what they're using. Pay now for their normal costs, no matter how much things are being used for the short term. That'll help, but also having that visibility to devices and usage is going to be important in understanding how employees are using this. You should expect some usage increases, but there were also probably opportunities to provide some optimization as well. Next question, should companies who are now requiring employees to work from home allow them to expense their internet connectivity? And what is a good percentage to reimburse, or should it be a flat rate? So interestingly, this question kind of depends on which state you're in. Some states have rules in place that actually that tell companies that they need to reimburse employees for any fair amount of technology usage. So for instance, California has that rule where I'm currently speaking from. And in that case, technically it should be either 100% or an agreed to rate that both the employee and the company have signed off on. That's maybe that may be an issue. That may be a policy that needs to be put in place or at least considered for the short term. Obviously, from a corporate perspective, you want to have a fair rate that represents what employees are actually using. But I would say first check with your state labor laws to see what you are mandated to provide to employees, and then put some sort of remote policy in place. Perhaps speaking with your finance team on what makes sense for them. And then second question: if I'm asked to install a profile on a personal device, should I not also be reimbursed for some of the cost of that device's usage? So that depends on, again, a similar question from perhaps expense or finance perspective, that this depends on how the device is used from a work perspective and whether it's considered necessary to empower the employee. If it is, your state may require some level of reimbursement, and it is definitely something that you should bring up with your organization. And then finally, last question: beyond endpoint security, what software do you recommend for BYOD, bring your own devices? So interestingly, from a bring your own device perspective, I think that there's also a need for scalable remote access to other clouds and applications. And then also, it's important to make sure that you're, as necessary, that you have some sort of VPN or encryption for connectivity. Those are the things I think of at first glance. Really, it depends on your situation. I'd be glad to chat, as I'm sure OneSource would as well, about this topic, as it really does depend on company to company basis.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Juan, and thank you guys for all attending today's webinar. A recorded version of this webinar will be available soon online and will also be emailed your way. We would love to hear from you with additional questions or feedback on what you learned. Please feel free to reach out to us at OneSource at events@ostcm.com. In the meantime, everyone please stay safe, healthy, and have a great afternoon.